Bro really got exiled because his only hobby was eating. One trip into a deadly dungeon later, he's surrounded by monsters with no way out, until an unexpected elf saves his life. So with that said, let's begin the story. During a lavish, elegant dinner, as candles flickered on the table set with silverware, a man with a cold, piercing gaze turned to his youngest son. The child, meanwhile, was devouring his food eagerly, almost greedily, as if afraid it would be taken away. The head of the family announced dryly and emotionlessly that Meikyuu would have to leave the house, as his presence there was no longer welcome. Looking at his own child, who did not even raise his head, the father declared with disgust in his voice that the boy had been born into a noble, respected family, but possessed not a shred of the dignity that should have been passed down to him through his bloodline. Rostbiff Du Bansenkai, a tall and imposing man, ordered the child with a sharp, impatient gesture not to finish his meal, for his appetite was nothing but repulsive. Looking his son over from head to toe, he remarked dismissively that the boy had a body that was too bloated and clumsy, and a puffy, foolish face that did not conform to aristocratic standards. Pressing his palm against his own face, as if trying to shield himself from shame, the man bitterly reported that just the other day, during a social reception, the Marquis himself had laughed and joked that Meikyuu bore a terrifying resemblance to an incredibly gluttonous and quick-witted troll who had accidentally been led into the noble gathering. Sitting down at the table and adjusting his cuffs, the man remarked with an icy smirk that no matter how much he taught his son noble manners, his animalistic, primal hunger for food would not go away, undoing all his efforts. Furthermore, with a tone of final judgment, he declared that he could no longer recognize this young man as part of his family, for he was tarnishing their ancient bloodline. Pausing and setting down his fork, the protagonist, whose heart ached with pain, asked with difficulty whether this meant that his father was officially disowning him as his heir. Then the man, his eyes flashing, replied harshly that this was exactly what would happen in the near future, and that everything would depend on the boy's future behavior. He sighed heavily. The young man noticed his relative toss a small, sealed envelope onto the table. Puzzled, he asked what exactly it was. Without even looking at him, his father coldly explained that it was an official pass to the underground, and the boy was obligated to go there, for it was the only thing he could do for his family. Immediately, the man added dismissively that the boy had already fulfilled his insignificant ancient noble duty simply by being born. Now he needed to take the pass, leave this house immediately, and try to become independent. Noticing that the child had grown even sadder and more dejected, Rostbiff mused aloud that the eldest son would inherit the title and the lands, which is why he was studying hard to manage the estates. The second son was actively serving as a scribe in the capital and advancing his career. At the same time, he noted with disdain that the youngest son had neither ambition, nor talent, nor physical strength. He was capable of nothing but eating endlessly. At that moment, Rostbiff, unable to contain himself, shouted that he was sick and tired of the boy's lack of talent, and that the boy needed to pack his belongings immediately and leave home that very evening. Before leaving the room and slamming the door behind him, the father hurled one last, cruel remark. He said that if the boy managed to make a name for himself in the dungeon and achieve success, then he could return, but until then, he had no place here. Bowing his head to hide the tears welling up in his eyes, the protagonist, his voice trembling yet firm, explained that he understood everything and would not argue. He then bowed deeply before his father, as etiquette demanded, and quietly thanked him for the years he had spent under this roof. As he left the room, Meikyuu, despite the lump in his throat, declared resolutely that he was heading to the dungeon immediately. Returning to his room, which suddenly seemed foreign and cold to him, the young man noticed a small, neatly packed suitcase lying on his bed. He thought that with this luggage, obviously packed by the servants, he would have to leave his family home. And yet, feeling a strange sense of relief, Meikyuu realized that this day had finally come, and he would have to leave this cramped room, where he had spent so many sad years. Besides, he had always known that one day, sooner or later, he would be driven out of the house, for he was surplus to requirements. The young man honestly admitted to himself that he was not as good as his older brothers, and indeed, in this cruel world, the third son had the least chance of success and recognition. However, Meikyuu abruptly halted the flow of his bitter thoughts, and he realized that right now, above all else, he needed to think not about the past, but about the imminent descent into a dangerous dungeon, where a single mistake would cost him his life. As he looked around his room, as if saying goodbye, he saw his clothes, provisions, books, and weapon laid out on the table. However, all of this had been bought with his father's money, and the young man proudly decided that he did not want to take any of it with him, not wishing to be indebted even in exile. He opened a small, secret drawer in the dresser. The protagonist took out a small, embroidered handkerchief, which was the only gift he had left from his late mother, still retaining the warmth of her hands. At that moment, the young man closed his eyes and recalled that his mother had been the only person in that house who had treated him with sincere kindness and boundless care, asking for nothing in return. Clutching this priceless gift in his hands, he firmly resolved that he would definitely take it with him on his journey as a good luck charm. He glanced at his old, scratched sword. He closed his eyes and realized that this was all he really needed to set out on a new path. After all these brief preparations, Meikyuu was ready to leave home for good. As he looked back at the family estate, which he had never been able to love, the protagonist tried with all his might to hold back the tears that threatened to escape. He mentally bid farewell to the place where he was born and raised, knowing he would never return here again. As he ran down the bustling, noisy street in downtown Kizoku, the protagonist was surprised to find a large number of all kinds of people around him. Lifting his head, he saw the massive building of the Adventurers Guild headquarters before him. A short while later, after filling out the paperwork, a pretty young woman behind the reception desk announced with a professional smile that his signature had been verified and that Meikyuu's registration with the guild was now complete. Somewhat taken aback by how quickly it had all happened, the young man was surprised that the process had turned out to be surprisingly simple and fast. Suddenly, a loud, authoritative female voice echoed through the hall, asking all new adventurers to attend the mandatory basic orientation before entering the dungeon. A pretty young woman wearing thick-rimmed glasses stood on a small stage and announced loudly and clearly that the mandatory briefing was about to begin and that all newcomers needed to come closer and listen carefully. In addition, she decided to start by covering the basics that every self-respecting adventurer should know. It turns out that, in reality, no one in this world knows the true nature of the dungeon's origin, and this remains a great mystery. However, it is precisely in this unfathomable, mysterious place that adventurers have continued for decades to tempt fate and pursue whatever lies hidden in the depths. That whatever consists of the unique and ferocious creatures that inhabit the dungeon, namely, monsters that know no mercy. The young woman, speaking in a lecturing tone, stated that the materials obtained from monsters are actually very useful and highly valued on the market. Furthermore, she emphasized that their guild would gladly purchase such items at any price, even the most favorable one. Adventurers risk their lives every day, gathering these valuable materials to earn a living and provide for their families. However, at that moment, the young woman's tone turned more serious and cautionary. She noted that monsters appear out of nowhere and without warning. For this very reason, she firmly believed adventurers must always be prepared for the most unexpected consequences and act instantly. Listening to all this, the protagonist thought with inward frustration that the dungeon was, in fact, an extremely dangerous place where death lurked around every corner. At that moment, the girl in glasses, noticing the frightened faces of the newcomers, felt it important to point out that, despite all the mortal danger, the dungeon offered the chance to fulfill one's wildest dreams and strike it rich. She then cheerfully announced that the basic briefing was now over and wished everyone good luck. Sitting on a park bench after the briefing, Meikyuu, feeling deceived, reflected on how his reckless father had lied to him. For this reason, he had come to the guild with no specific goal other than to survive. He watched the stern, battle-hardened warriors passing by. He thought about how each of these men was ready to sacrifice his own life, challenging the dungeons and fighting monsters. Suddenly, Meikyuu glanced at his old sword hanging from his belt and admitted to himself that from now on, he was no longer a nobleman, but an ordinary adventurer. That same evening, completely exhausted after a hard day, the protagonist lay on a hard, sagging bed in a cheap hostel. He noted that the bed here was quite hard and uncomfortable. He looked up at the unfamiliar ceiling, a broken window, and extremely shabby walls all around him. Looking at his pale, weary reflection in the cloudy mirror, Meikyuu bitterly recalled the words his father had once said to him as a child. Back then, his father, watching him train, had reluctantly admitted that the boy had good natural reflexes and that he should devote his life to the military in the future. As a young, naive child, the protagonist happily agreed with his father, eager to earn his love. It turned out that as a child, Meikyuu had studied fencing in order to join a knightly order and bring glory to his family's name. During training back then, he tried very hard, giving it his all. His coach, an old warrior, constantly reminded him that if the boy showed true talent with the sword, his strict father would finally acknowledge him and be proud of him. Smiling, the mentor encouraged the boy, saying that he would surely be able to show his father his impressive skills. Eager to earn his father's long-awaited recognition, the protagonist honed his combat skills with admirable tenacity. Moreover, he triumphed in practice matches at home, easily defeating his peers. The protagonist was absolutely certain that this time, his father would definitely praise him. And so, with all his might, his legs barely moving, he ran to his father's study to share his joy. Instead of the expected, long-awaited approval and warm praise, the protagonist received only a harsh, undeserved punishment from his father. In a fit of inexplicable, blind rage, the man asked why he couldn't lose on purpose, and he warned him not to dare bring shame upon him. On top of that, he called his young son a shameless brat. As Meikyuu recalls, he was scolded very harshly that day, and after that, there were times when his father would get angry at him over the slightest misstep. However, as a child, he himself did not understand what was the real reason behind such a cruel, cold attitude toward him. As a child, the protagonist desperately wanted to see a smile on his father's face and earn his love. To that end, he studied hard, honed his martial arts skills, and tried to be perfect. And yet, the young man bitterly admitted that he didn't know whether his father would ever truly accept him, even after all those incredible efforts. At the time, the protagonist suspected that perhaps his father had always seen only his older brothers and his children, and that he was nothing more than an unfortunate mistake to him. Shortly after this disappointment, he became obsessed with food, finding in it his only solace. Driven by inner despair and emotional emptiness, Meikyuu ate endlessly, slept a lot, and spent his days in idleness. As a result, his body and spirit swelled. He lost his shape and turned into that very same clumsy young man whom everyone used to laugh at. And yet, lying in his hostel room, staring at the ceiling, the protagonist realized with sadness that he was hungry again. He unwrapped a small package of cheap food he bought earlier. He took his first bite and realized with disgust that it was hard, stale bread and stale, stringy chicken. Sighing heavily at this reality, the young man realized that it was very unappetizing, but now he would have to get used to such meager, coarse food if he wanted to survive. Looking at his meager pouch of copper coins, Meikyuu realized with alarm that he didn't have enough supplies to last very long. He then decided that, by all accounts, he had no other choice but to go into the labyrinth, take a risk, and try to earn some money. However, the young man understood with a chill of fear that he might very well perish in the dungeon, and in that case, no one would truly be able to help him, and he would die alone. At that moment, unable to bear the tension any longer, the protagonist burst into tears. He realized that his own family didn't need a little piglet who did nothing but eat and sleep. Clutching a tasteless sandwich in his hands, he cried out in despair into the void that his father had abandoned him like a useless thing. Covering his face with his hands to hide his tears, Meikyuu realized he had nowhere else to go, and in order to survive in this cruel world, he needed to find a way to earn a living somewhere. Then he remembered his father's cold words, who had said that the young man could return home only if he managed to achieve something significant in the dungeon. Before going to sleep, wiping his wet cheeks, the young man firmly resolved that tomorrow he would definitely visit the guild and begin taking on quests. The morning of his second day as an adventurer began with the protagonist finally mustering his courage and arriving at the entrance to the dungeon. He noticed that there were a lot of people around him, just like at a bustling night market. After a while, having passed by the patrols, the young man, to his surprise, stopped and realized that he had reached the second underground level without any trouble. He then surmised that, because of the large number of people on the upper levels, there were significantly fewer monsters there. Before entering the second level, the protagonist noticed that the air here was clearly different from that on the upper levels. It had become more humid and colder. In addition, he noticed that the number of people, which had been so high on the first floor, had also decreased significantly. Looking around in the eerie silence, Meikyuu thought about how he needed to find something he could sell for money. He also recalled the words of his instructor during training, who had sternly warned that monsters always appear out of nowhere, and that an adventurer can consider himself as good as dead the very moment he lets his guard down. At that moment, he also remembered that it was mostly beginners like him who met their end on the second underground level, where more dangerous creatures dwelled. At that very moment, the young man, straining his senses, saw a small but aggressive goblin right in front of him. He froze in place, realizing that somewhere nearby, just around the corner, there was surely a whole nest of these creatures. Meikyuu instinctively knew that this creature would try to overpower him, and this realization terrified him to the core. Suddenly, the goblin let out a piercing shriek, lunged forward, and charged toward the young man. A couple of moments later, drawn by the noise, several more monsters burst out of the darkness, and their numbers kept growing. As he fled from his pursuers, the young man realized that things were looking extremely dire, since they were far too fast and would catch up to him. He'd heard terrifying stories about them before, but he never imagined there would be so many of them, and that they'd all attack at once. At that moment, the protagonist, overcome by animal panic, began frantically thinking about what to do next. Turning around, he discovered with horror that he had run into a dead end, and his retreat was cut off. Holding his trembling sword out in front of him, he urged the creatures not to approach him, even though he knew they wouldn't understand him. However, at that moment, the young man's entire body, paralyzed by fear, was gripped by an icy terror. Because of this, his movements were clumsy and slow, as if he were stuck in molasses. Standing with his back pressed against the cold stone wall, he reflected that he would die just like this, a novice adventurer who had achieved nothing in this life. At that very moment, the goblin let out a triumphant cry and pounced on the young man. And the young man, closing his eyes tightly, realized that his life had been utterly tasteless and empty. Meikyuu realized that he was still alone, and he assumed that even if he died right now, no one would notice. Besides, he thought that no one would even mourn him, and his death would go unnoticed. However, even if that were the case, he didn't understand why his body still wanted to fight. Suddenly, at the most critical moment, Meikyuu saw a goblin hiss and fall dead, pierced by someone's arrow. A pleasant, clear female voice called out to him from around the corner, asking anxiously if he was a novice adventurer. A young woman with light hair, a bow in her hands, appeared in the passageway and also asked sympathetically if the young man was all right. After making sure the young man was safe and sound, the girl moved on, light and graceful as a shadow, deeper into the labyrinth. As he watched his savior, the protagonist caught a glimpse of a short, elegant bow and a quiver filled to the brim with feathered arrows behind her back. He also noticed her clothing, made of soft, sturdy fur like that of a forest hunter, which revealed her to be someone accustomed to life in the wild. Meikyuu surmised that the girl most likely belonged to a forest people and was probably an elf, the kind he had read so much about in books. And yet, putting his thoughts aside, the protagonist thanked the girl from the bottom of his heart. He sincerely told her that she had really come to his rescue and saved him from certain death. However, the girl, adjusting the strap of her quiver, gently objected. She explained that he shouldn't thank her, especially since it's customary in the dungeon to help one another, for this place has no place for loners. The young man then remarked bitterly that, unfortunately, there weren't actually that many people in the dungeon who were truly capable of coming to someone's aid, and that most people only thought of themselves. He also added that the stranger, by all accounts, was a very kind and compassionate person. Placing her hand on her heart in a playful gesture, the girl said with a slight smile that she was a kind elf, and that this was her calling. Then, turning serious, she noted that dying in such a gloomy and damp place was extremely boring, and that the young man needed to be much more careful next time. After a brief farewell, the elf vanished quickly and silently around the corner. The protagonist was left alone. He realized that he really didn't want to die here in this cold darkness, and that he was ready to fight for his life. He also bitterly recalled his father's words that he would have to leave this house, and that he was good for nothing. Meikyuu once again felt the pangs of exile. He recalled how he had been cast out of his own home like a useless object. At that moment, he bitterly concluded that, unlike his older, successful brothers, he was utterly good for nothing. And yet, deep down, the young man understood that even he, the lowest of outcasts, had a sacred right to choose between life and death. It was for this very reason that he vowed to do everything in his power to survive. He took a deep breath to calm his wildly pounding heart. The protagonist decided to press forward and take another step into the unknown. Suddenly, peeking around the corner, he saw another goblin standing before him. He thought with annoyance that his suspicions had been confirmed. At this level of the labyrinth, there really were far more monsters like this one. Gripping his sword tightly, Meikyuu tried to calm himself with the thought that there was only one enemy, and he could handle it. However, doubt crept back into his mind, and the young man was already thinking about taking a step back and leaving. At that moment, the goblin, sensing its prey, spun around sharply and took a menacing step forward. Trying to dodge its swift attack, the young man realized with horror that his body was too heavy and sluggish, and that dodging was much harder than he'd thought. Then, closing his eyes tightly, he recalled the days when he had diligently studied fencing under his old mentor. The old man often repeated that in martial arts, timing is the most important thing. It's what determines the outcome of a battle. However, he also reminded him that every warrior has his own unique timing, and if the adventurer fails to find his own rhythm, most of his training will simply be pointless. Furthermore, the teacher strongly advised him to set his own pace. And if you can't figure out intuitively, you should simply start counting to yourself, measuring out your strikes and steps. He also noted that once Meikyuu mastered this important skill, he would be able to deal much more damage to his opponent, and do so naturally, simply by swinging his sword at the right moment. In addition, while demonstrating the techniques, the instructor explained that one could use one's own body weight as a powerful lever to deliver a devastating attack. The protagonist recalled that the instructor his family had once hired had taught him all the basic fencing techniques in great detail and with meticulous care. And now, standing on the second floor of a labyrinth, the young man gripped his sword tightly in his hands. He thought that to win, he simply needed to choose the right moment and trust completely in his sword and his body, which remembered every movement. Standing face to face with the goblin, he waited for the right moment, mentally urging himself not to hesitate or tremble. As he closed in on the goblin, Meikyuu calmed himself, preparing his sword for the strike. He also remembered that as the enemy approached, he needed to start counting to find the right rhythm. As soon as the goblin let out a piercing shriek and rushed toward him, Meikyuu began counting down, feeling as if time were slowing down. In the next instant, the protagonist's sword, tracing a perfect arc, delivered a crushing, precise blow to the monster. The goblin froze, then collapsed to the ground. He stopped, breathing heavily. Meikyuu couldn't believe he had just won his first victory on his own. At that moment, he reflected on how it seemed like a very long time had passed from the moment he began moving until the moment it stopped. However, in reality, only an instant had passed. Breathing heavily, the protagonist realized that he had just taken a creature's life with his own hands. He understood that in order to survive and become a true adventurer, he would have to overcome this inner turmoil and accept the brutal reality of the dungeon. Then, try not to look at the body, he bent down, and he cut off the goblin's ears. He put them in his bag to sell later at the guild. After taking a sip of water from his flask and feeling his strength drain away, Meikyuu sat down against the rough wall. He realized how exhausted he was, and that he had truly never in his life tasted water as delicious as this, when every sip was worth its weight in gold. Leaving the labyrinth, the protagonist mused that the goblin ears he'd obtained for the first time should bring him at least a little income to sustain him going forward. Stretching in the fresh air, he stood at the exit and realized that today's hunt could be considered over. Suddenly, from around the corner near the entrance, several frightened adventurers appeared, running for their lives to escape something terrible. Explaining what had happened as they ran, the strangers reported that it was all due to a sudden invasion of kobolds. It also turned out that, for now, a brave elf woman was holding off the danger, but by all accounts, she wouldn't be able to hold out much longer on her own. Hearing this, Meikyuu, whose heart sank with anxiety, surmised that they were talking about the very same girl who had saved his life. Without a moment's hesitation, he broke into a run. As he ran, the young man recalled how incredibly strong and confident the elf had looked when she saved him. And yet he realized that even if he made it there, he might be of no use and would only get in the way. However, at that very moment, he recalled the girl's words, in which she had claimed that dying in a place like this was incredibly boring. Picking up speed, the protagonist realized he couldn't leave the girl in trouble, and he hoped to make it in time to help her. At the same time, the elf, standing on the battlefield, was desperately fighting a huge magical creature. It looked like a werewolf with burning eyes. She thought to herself that she was only on the first underground level, and yet she was already having to fight such a dangerous monster. Looking at her opponent, the girl realized that it was very strong, as she hadn't imagined earlier that a kobold could turn out to be such a formidable and swift foe. Pausing to catch her breath, she suddenly realized that with her bow's rate of fire, she might simply not have time to shoot enough arrows. She had to find a way to stop her opponent's rapid advance. Suddenly, the elf noticed that the enemy had made a decisive lunge and was about to defeat her. She froze, realizing she wouldn't make it in time. However, unexpectedly, the protagonist stepped in front of her, standing in the monster's path with complete confidence and determination, eager to save his friend. She was taken aback by his sudden appearance. The girl asked with surprise and concern why this reckless young man had come to her aid. Moreover, she sternly pointed out that he needed to leave the labyrinth as soon as possible before it was too late. However, Meikyuu, who had already made up his mind, disagreed with her. He declared loudly and firmly that adventurers in the dungeon must help one another, and he could not abandon her. Still, the girl, assessing the danger, felt it was important to point out that the monster standing before them was a creature from the 4th underground level. It feeds on corpses and possesses incredible strength. She asked the young man to leave, explaining that the enemy was extremely dangerous. Furthermore, the elf explained that the monster was hunting her specifically, and the young man shouldn't get involved in this conflict if he didn't want to die. Sighing and gathering his courage, the protagonist, feeling his knees tremble but refusing to back down, declared that the girl was selfish if she wanted to die alone. Still, he admitted that he really wasn't as brave or strong as she was. But his recent experiences had taught him that he shouldn't give up, even when everything seemed hopeless. Furthermore, Meikyuu was absolutely certain that if they joined forces and worked together, they would definitely be able to defeat this dangerous enemy. Looking at this stubborn young man, the elf finally relented. With complete confidence and warmth in her voice, she declared that he was a good and noble person. Reluctantly agreeing with his friend's opinion, Meikyuu reminded her with a wry smile that dying in a place like this would be very boring. Hearing this, the girl smiled back and confirmed that what he said was indeed true. In that case, the two of them needed to move forward and fight together. Looking ahead at the approaching monster, the elf, gripping her bow, asked briefly whether they would really be able to defeat this monster together. After making sure her companion's intentions were still serious, she prepared for battle and asked him to join her. Plucking up his courage, the protagonist, feeling a rush of adrenaline, charged toward the enormous monster with a loud cry. He delivered a slashing blow with his sword. These desperate actions paid off. The creature truly staggered from the surprise. Trying his hardest, Meikyuu turned to his friend to ask whether he was actually helping or just getting in the way. But at that very moment, the monster, having recovered from the blow, deftly parried the next attack. And with a powerful swipe of its paw, it sent the young man flying to the side. Seeing this, the elf girl cried out in despair that things were looking bad and they needed to flee immediately to regroup. A few minutes later, after they had run behind a rock and caught their breath, the adventurers calmed down a bit. The protagonist, breathing heavily, asked what they should do next. He also suggested retreating and leaving the labyrinth to save their lives. However, this didn't sit well with the girl, who was determined. She said that retreating wouldn't solve their problem. The protagonist, gathering his thoughts, said reassuringly that everything would be all right. He wasn't entirely sure of success, but he had come up with a daring idea. He then clarified that he needed the elf girl's strength, since her precise archery skills could stop the enemy, at least for a little while, so that it couldn't move. Meikyuu explained that while his friend was taking aim and looking for a weak spot, he would distract the enemy by drawing its attention to himself, risking his life. Smiling at his bravery, the girl said admiringly that she couldn't believe the same guy standing before her was the one who, just a short while ago, had been trembling with fear at the sight of mere goblins. And yet, as she adjusted her arrow, she noted that she accepted the young man's offer, even though the chances of both of them surviving were extremely slim. Before the attack, the elf, with a serious expression, assured him that she would do everything in her power not to let him down. The protagonist, turning toward the monster that was already prowling in search of them, called out to it loudly. He thrust his sword-wielding arm forward, provoking it to attack, drawing the enormous creature's attention to himself. He understood that if the girl's arrow hit its mark and temporarily stopped the monster, they would have a real chance of victory. However, he also realized that even the slightest mistake could cost him his life. And yet Meikyuu realized that acting as bait was the best he could do right now. When the monster, enraged by his audacity, lunged at him, the young man tried to fend it off and let the enemy get as close as possible to keep its attention. However, the distance remained critical, and the young man had to get closer and closer to the terrifying creature, feeling its hot breath on him. At that very dangerous moment, he suddenly felt a strange premonition. And at that very second, as if on command, a precise arrow fired by the elf struck its mark, piercing the monster. Watching his utterly focused friend, who was already knocking the next arrow, the protagonist shouted loudly that she could deliver the final blow to the immobilized monster. Not wanting to waste precious time, Meikyuu, shouting, rushed toward the monster on his own. As soon as his opponent was defenseless and froze for a moment, the young man, mustering all his strength, delivered a precise, fatal blow with his sword straight to the neck. Stunned by his own audacity, Meikyuu slowly approached the body of his defeated opponent and, after making sure it wasn't breathing, concluded that the monster was dead. In a burst of joy and relief, the elf, unable to contain her emotions, hugged the young man tightly. She exclaimed with delight that it had been a job well done, and she was alive only thanks to his courage and selflessness. Taken aback by such a passionate display of emotion, the protagonist didn't know how to respond to her words of gratitude. Then, feeling embarrassed, he said she shouldn't praise him, since he hadn't done anything special. He'd simply been doing his duty. However, the girl, pointing to his hands, replied with a smile that there was already proof that the young man had triumphed and grown stronger. Noticing the young man's genuine confusion, she asked him to look at himself and listen to his feelings. As he looked at his own hands, the protagonist heard the girl's voice warning him that it would hurt a little and that he would have to endure it just a little longer. At that moment, he felt as if his entire body were burning from the inside. Meikyuu managed to describe this strange sensation as a complete numbness that sent shivers down his entire body. At that very moment, burning with curiosity, he wanted to ask her what exactly this strange sensation was. Smiling at his directness, the girl asked enigmatically, "So, what do you think of the exaltation now?" Noticing his obvious confusion, she decided to explain that this unique sensation appears at the very moment you defeat a powerful monster in a dungeon. Furthermore, The elf noted that, for the most part, such changes affect both the body and the spirit. It turned out that this is a form of physical or spiritual strengthening granted for overcoming danger. Furthermore, the nature of these changes varies from person to person. It's individual. Seeing that he didn't understand, the girl then explained that all this simply meant the young man had risen one level higher as a living being. Pondering what he had heard, the protagonist said doubtfully that he hadn't yet noticed any drastic changes in himself. In response, his friend honestly admitted that this doesn't happen every time, and to be honest, she herself doesn't quite understand exactly how it works. It's one of the mysteries of the dungeons. Still, wanting to reassure him, she said that it takes time to get used to the changes that occur after ascension. Besides, his friend added with a wink that the young man would wake up tomorrow morning to find that something in his body had indeed changed. However, she considered it far more important that Meikyuu had saved her by clearing a line of fire at the monster and preventing it from killing her. The girl thanked her friend again, this time more heartfeltly, and asked with genuine curiosity whether he had actually sensed exactly when she was about to fire the arrows, so he could jump out of the way in time. After thinking for a moment and listening to his inner voice, the protagonist admitted that he'd simply had a strong feeling that something was about to happen in the next second, and he trusted that feeling. And yet the girl, smiling, admitted that ever since early childhood, she'd had to constantly be aware of other people's glances. Most likely, her keen observation was simply a habit developed over years of living in the forest. At that moment, Meikyuu, sensing that they were getting along well, asked whether she worked alone or as part of a group with others. The elf, adjusting her bow, replied that, just like him, she was a lone adventurer, since she found it difficult to trust people. On top of that, she finally introduced herself officially as Gracie. She explained that she was a hunter from a clan of ancient elves living in the forest. Furthermore, looking him straight in the eye, she admitted that she absolutely had to make her way down to the 5th floor of a labyrinth, and she was looking for a reliable companion for this dangerous journey. And if the guy is looking for the same thing, Gracie is ready to invite him to join her group. She also confided that she could trust him, for she could see his purity. Looking into the girl's eyes, the protagonist was surprised to note that she had a very direct, open, and honest gaze. And at that very moment, he recalled his father's words, who had said that the young man was capable of nothing but constantly eating, like a mad troll. However, Meikyuu recalled with bitterness that all the gazes directed at him in the past had always been cold and sharp as a knife. And perhaps, for the first time in his life, someone was looking at him differently, with warmth and respect. At that moment, the young man gathered his courage, introduced himself, and honestly revealed that he was the 3rd son of an aristocrat who had been driven from his own home for being useless. He also indicated that, by all accounts, he could trust his new friend as well. Then the elf, with hope in her voice, asked if the young man would really agree to her proposal and go with her into the dangerous dungeon. Smiling his first genuine smile in a long time, the protagonist said he was very happy to have met her. He also honestly admitted that he had been scared and lonely exploring the dungeon on his own, and that with Gracie by his side, he would feel much calmer and more confident. After hearing his sincere words, Gracie smiled broadly in response. She noted that she was very happy to hear that, and that now they were a team. That same evening, Meikyuu was sitting in a cozy tavern. He was having dinner, taking in his surroundings with particular interest. He reflected on the past day, which had been full of danger. He thought about how incredibly lucky he was that the mysterious elf had been right there at the right time and in the right place. As he mentally tallied his meager savings, he realized that he still had a great deal to do to return home and prove his worth. He held in his hands the reward for slaying the monster and a guild card under someone else's name. The young man realized with surprise that he would never have received any of this had he remained an aristocrat. At that very moment, Gracie walked into the tavern with a light step. She apologized for keeping him waiting. Carrying trays of steaming plates, she announced with a smile that it was time for dinner, and since he had saved her life, she insisted that she would treat him to dinner. Delighted, but trying to hide it, the protagonist stopped himself and politely said that a verbal thank you would be more than enough. After all, the girl had also saved his life, so they were even. Laughing at his amusing seriousness, Gracie said she was very hungry after the battle, so she suggested they eat their fill and celebrate their shared victory. Raising a mug of frothy drink, the elf proposed a toast to their alliance. On the table stood a mouth-watering roast chicken, a fragrant mushroom and vegetable stew, as well as a fresh salad with nuts and fluffy rolls. As he sampled the unfamiliar dishes, Meikyuu thought about how he had no idea what kind of meat was used in the dish, nor did he even know the chef who had prepared it. Smiling at his own thoughts, he remembered that such behavior would be a grave breach of etiquette in the world of the aristocracy. However, the food was so delicious and fragrant that he certainly had no intention of complaining. Besides, Meikyuu took immense pleasure in the fact that he was eating a meal paid for with money he'd earned himself. He took pride in knowing that this was the result of his first visit to the dungeon. He was glad that no one was scolding him for every bite, and that sitting next to him was the girl who had shared a dangerous battle with him. And yet, as Gracie served him seconds, she turned to her friend and told him not to hesitate to order more food. She believed that growing boys needed to eat plenty of hearty meals to regain their strength. After thanking them for their concern, the young man admitted with a touch of sadness that he needed to lose the excess weight that was preventing him from moving quickly in combat. He also said he planned to take advantage of this opportunity to lose a significant amount of weight in order to become more resilient. After listening to her new friend, the elf declared with confidence and approval that this was a wonderful attitude, and she would support him in it. And yet, with a mischievous smile, she immediately called over the innkeeper and asked him to bring another meat dish so they could celebrate the beginning of their friendship. Enjoying this warm, cozy evening, the protagonist finally relaxed. He realized that, after all, it seemed to him that a meal after his first productive day of work was the best thing in the world. Sitting in a cozy tavern where the fireplace crackled and the air smelled of fresh bread, Gracie, taking a sip from her mug, suddenly turned to her new friend with a practical question. She asked if he had thought about buying some new gear for their joint adventures. Taken aback by the question, the protagonist was genuinely surprised, since he hadn't even considered buying anything other than food. Still, Gracie, adjusting her bow, explained that she was referring specifically to their joint plans to explore the labyrinth, where she would fight from a distance with her bow, while he would engage in close combat with his sword. She explained that it would be much more effective if the young man took the lead, absorbing the brunt of the attack, while she covered him from the rear, shooting at the enemies. The elf backed up her opinion by pointing out that in their last battle, their tactics had worked perfectly, and they had survived. However, she also felt it was important to explain that the risk of sustaining a serious injury was much higher on the front lines. Therefore, the young man definitely needed to buy good, reliable armor that would save his life. With a heavy sigh, the protagonist, who was used to light clothing, admitted regretfully that he really hadn't thought about armor, which is a vital part of any adventurer's gear. At that moment, he wondered thoughtfully whether he should buy heavy metal armor, like that worn by knights. Gracie shook her head doubtfully. She pointed out that it would be difficult to find such armor in his size. Glancing at his figure, she explained sadly that it would be extremely difficult to find armor that would fit his build. Thinking aloud, Meikyuu asked if there was any kind of protection that could keep him safe in battle until he got in shape. He also made a firm promise that, until then, he would do his very best to lose weight. After thinking it over for a moment and assessing his potential, the girl suggested he get some lightweight leather armor to protect his vital organs, or even just get a sturdy shield to deflect blows. Hearing this, Meikyuu realized with hope that with a shield, he would be able to parry even the monster's swift attacks. Fortunately, he remembered that he still had some money left over, money he'd taken from home, just in case. Still, feeling a bit awkward, he turned to his friend and asked how much exactly he would need for such a purchase. Gracie then spread her arms in doubt. She said it was hard for her to give an exact price, since it all depended on the quality of the item. Still, she asked in surprise why the young man thought he had to pay for the armor himself. After all, they were partners now. Not understanding her question, the protagonist remarked in bewilderment that this matter concerned only his personal expenses, and he had to resolve the issue himself so as not to be indebted to anyone. At that moment, the girl, touched by his independence, felt her hands tremble slightly. She stood up from the table. She declared with firm conviction that they were now a team and had to split everything evenly. Furthermore, she expressed a strong desire to pay half the cost of his equipment as a contribution to their common cause. Hearing his categorical refusal, the elf reminded him that they were partners, and such a mutually beneficial relationship was a given. Smiling at her persistence, the protagonist finally gave in. He agreed to let the girl pay half the cost of his armor. However, he immediately set a condition in return, that he would cover most of the cost of their shared meals so he could feel useful. Furthermore, Meikyuu declared that this matter was absolutely non-negotiable and not open to reconsideration. Laughing at his stubbornness, the elf admitted that her new friend was very amusing. And yet, already making plans for the next day, she said that tomorrow they would set out in search of the perfect armor. The next day, the protagonist gazed at the multitude of weapon shops with genuine amazement. He couldn't believe that the city they were in had such a huge number of shops for adventurers, catering to every taste and budget. At that moment, his gaze fell on a beautiful, gleaming shield displayed in the shop window. He thought it looked pretty good, and he decided it was worth buying. However, his friend, noticing this, stopped Meikyuu just in time. She sternly warned him that he was being extremely foolish by trying to walk into one of the most expensive stores in town. At that moment, she pointed to a modest establishment nearby. A tired doorman stood at the entrance. The elf, being more experienced, explained that the young man was still a novice adventurer, and as a beginner, he needed to choose simpler places. After listening carefully to his friend, the protagonist fully agreed with her opinion. He bitterly realized that, out of old habit, he had behaved like an arrogant aristocrat accustomed to throwing money around. From now on, he needed to be much more careful and frugal. Sighing with relief that he had heeded her advice, Gracie firmly declared that she herself would choose the best place to shop. Turning to her friend, she suddenly asked what exactly he knew about the dwarves. At that moment, the elf lowered her voice and explained that the dwarves were, by nature, rough and unsociable. But they forged steel with truly divine skill. She said it would be much better if they stopped by one of their workshops. A little while later, after they had already visited several modest shops, Gracie, tired of choosing, asked her friend what he liked. They stepped into the next blacksmith shop, where the smell of hot metal filled the air. A young apprentice greeted them. He asked in surprise what exactly these unusual travelers were looking for. Then the protagonist, feeling awkward, honestly admitted that they were looking for reliable armor. On top of that, he needed to have an old sword sharpened, as it had become dull. Upon hearing mention of the weapon in their conversation, a burly man emerged from the back of the workshop. He asked to see the sword. Noticing the stocky figure and the shop clerk's reaction, Meikyuu respectfully realized that he was standing before a genuine dwarf. The man was short, but his body, hardened in the forge and covered in scars, was a solid mass of muscle. Moreover, the protagonist sensed nonverbal pressure from the blacksmith, who had extremely insistently asked him to demonstrate his weapon. Not daring to contradict such a master, Meikyuu held out his sword to him with a trembling hand. Assessing the condition of the weapon with professional meticulousness, the blacksmith, twirling the blade in his hands, noted that he was looking at good, solid steel that would last a long time. He also pointed out that while the blade was a bit too blunt for a rapier, its balance was perfectly centered, making it ideal for hacking down monsters. Furthermore, Dwarf, running his finger along the edge, explained with satisfaction that it was an excellent weapon, free of any nicks or warping, as if it had just been forged. Handing the sword back to the young man, he dryly concluded that the adventurer could carry this weapon for a long time to come, and nothing would happen to it. The blacksmith also noted that the sword required no maintenance and was ready for any challenge. After hearing such a detailed and expert analysis, Meikyuu sincerely thanked the man for his time and expertise. At the same time, the elf, familiar with the customs of this people, whispered that dwarves are sometimes the very picture of courtesy. Since they are eloquent only with steel, and people are of no interest to them at all, they find them boring. He sighed in surprise at such candor. The protagonist looked at the dwarf once more, who was already intently examining another piece of metal, having forgotten they were even there. However, at that very moment, the young man behind the counter, smiling politely, apologized for his master's behavior. He also explained that although this man was a loner, he knew his craft better than anyone else in the area. Smiling back, the protagonist assured his companion that everything was fine and that he shouldn't worry about it. Still, taking the opportunity, he asked if their shop carried a good, lightweight shield for a beginner. The salesman thought for a moment, then suggested they check out the Melon workshop across the street. After all, they had excellent gear at reasonable prices. However, a few moments later, as if coming to his senses, he announced that there might be some minor service issues there. Exchanging glances, Gracie and Meikyuu had absolutely no idea what he was talking about, but they decided to take a chance. Inside the Melon shop, where dim light reigned and the air smelled of dust, the brusque saleswoman sized up the customer at a glance. She told him mockingly that there was no armor in the whole world suitable for a troll like Meikyuu, and that they shouldn't waste their time. Trying not to let such rude words upset him, the protagonist calmly stated that he didn't need a full set of armor. He was interested in something else. At that moment, Gracie, unable to tolerate the insult, indignantly declared that comparing a customer to a troll was the height of rudeness and unprofessionalism. With a smirk, the saleswoman retorted contemptuously that a person only becomes a customer after they hand over their money and buy something. She then felt it important to point out that Meikyuu really did look fat, and that was a fact. Upset by such rudeness, the elf flashed her eyes and firmly replied that the guy was actually quite agile for his build and was a quick learner. Moreover, she made it clear that they had indeed come to buy something, not to listen to insults. Angered that she'd been interrupted, the saleswoman snapped rudely that the elf was a talkative girl. She was eagerly waiting for her to finally say what they needed and get out of there. At that moment, Gracie turned to the young man and asked him to explain what he needed. Smiling despite the rudeness, the protagonist said he needed a small, maneuverable shield to defend against fast monsters. She asked him to repeat himself. The merchant roughly struck the young man on the shoulder, testing his reaction. She asked mockingly why he was considering the most useless piece of equipment, one used only by suicidal people. Furthermore, the merchant, being an expert, noted that, apparently, the young man had decided that if the shield were small, it would be easier to use. But this was a dangerous misconception. It turned out that such complex equipment requires a great deal of experience and excellent reflexes on the part of the adventurer. Furthermore, the merchant emphasized that when using a small shield, one must have very good parrying skills, not just mindlessly putting up a block. Overwhelmed by this barrage of information, the protagonist timidly replied that, in that case, he probably needed a larger and heavier shield. However, this answer didn't satisfy the saleswoman either. She confidently stated that, judging by his hands, the young man lacked the physical strength to handle a large shield for long periods in combat. At that moment, feeling cornered, the protagonist asked directly what, in that case, would be suitable for him to protect himself and that he could carry into the labyrinth. The saleswoman, having lost interest in the argument, pointed to a pair of gauntlets made of genuine, thick, multi-layered leather hanging on the wall. She also calmly explained that these gauntlets were secured with sturdy rivets that fit very comfortably on the arm and wouldn't come off in battle. However, she immediately added that this equipment would only be suitable for fighting monsters from the early levels. Against steel or magic, they wouldn't be of any help, and they could be easily pierced. Surprised by the quality of the craftsmanship, Meikyuu, without hesitation, said that in that case, he'd take it. Surprised that he wasn't haggling, the merchant remarked with genuine bewilderment that this was the first time she'd seen someone willing to buy an item without trying it on or haggling over the price. At that moment, the protagonist confidently explained that he was looking at an excellent item that fully met all his current needs. After hearing this, the merchant softened her tone and remarked that usually people first ask about the price of the item or at least imagine how it would fit them. Meikyuu explained with a slight smile that, as the saleswoman herself had said earlier, the customer is the person who pays, and he simply wanted to purchase the item he needed. They could chat after the transaction was complete. Smiling sincerely for the first time, the saleswoman admitted that the young man, it turned out, was very quick-witted and didn't mince words. For this very reason, showing him respect, she asked the protagonist to follow her into the fitting room. A short while later, after a professional fitting, the salesperson had perfectly matched the gauntlets for the young man. Meikyuu couldn't believe he was buying his first piece of personal gear that belonged solely to him. Looking at himself in the mirror he realized with pride that he now looked a little more like a real adventurer and less like a pathetic outcast. Moreover, Meikyuu took pride in the fact that this gear was neither made of gold nor silver, nor was it adorned with gemstones. But despite that, these simple leather gauntlets were far more precious and valuable to him than anything he'd ever owned before. After all, he'd bought them with money he'd earned honestly, with his own hands. Smiling at his pride, the girl turned to her friend, noting that, as far as she could tell, he really liked the gear and it fit him perfectly. She also mentioned that his determination had pleasantly surprised her. Nevertheless, she had to admit that the item was truly worth the price and of high quality. Then the protagonist, unable to hide his joy, remarked that he really liked the purchase. He also sincerely thanked the girl for her invaluable help and moral support. As he said goodbye to the saleswoman, he said with feeling that it had been an excellent purchase and that he would definitely stop by the store again once he'd saved up some money. Smiling as he left, the saleswoman replied briefly that she'd be happy to have him back and was always glad to see good customers. As soon as the young people left the store and stepped out onto the street, the main character, feeling more confident, noted that he was the only one doing the shopping today. He politely asked if his friend would like to buy anything for herself. After thinking for a moment, Gracie shook her head and said she didn't need anything from the store. However, a couple of moments later, she mysteriously turned to her friend with a suggestion to visit a certain place, and she would like the young man to keep her company. Agreeing and feeling curious, the protagonist cautiously asked where exactly the girl wanted to take him. Taking Meikyuu by the hand, the adventuress smiled mysteriously. She told him she was going to show him a true paradise on earth, where he could rest both body and soul. A short while later, the elf, with a joyful sparkle in her eyes, announced that they had arrived at their destination. The protagonist gazed with genuine amazement at the magnificent, intricately carved building and asked in awe, "What is this beautiful place?" Then the girl, spreading her arms wide, explained that before them stood the great bathhouse, famous throughout the continent. With his mouth agape in amazement, Meikyuu remarked with genuine admiration that it was impressive and looked just like a palace. Gracie exclaimed enthusiastically that it was as lively here every day as a festival. Just stepping inside instantly gave you a burst of energy and made your fatigue disappear. However, the main character was more interested in why they had ended up in this place at this very moment. Gracie then replied honestly, though a bit shyly, that she had really enjoyed spending the whole day yesterday walking around the stalls with her boyfriend and chatting. Today, she wanted to show him a place that she herself really liked. Handing the attendant a few coins, she asked for 2 tickets. At that very moment, the elf turned around and deftly tossed the young man a clean towel and a bar of fragrant soap. And she said that they were done for the day and could go their separate ways. Smiling, Gracie mysteriously remarked that once you experience the delights of this bathhouse, time ceases to exist and all your problems fade away. Stunned by such philosophy, the protagonist was about to call out to his friend to ask about the rules, but she merely wished him a pleasant rest and, with a smile, disappeared through the door to the women's section. Left alone in the bustling lobby, the young man decided there really was nothing else to do, and that he, too, should try to relax and unwind. Upon entering the men's bathhouse, he was surprised to find that there were many adults and children there. After leaving his personal belongings in a locker and grabbing a small basin, Meikyuu opened a massive, carved door. At that moment, he was greeted by the sight of a luxurious, marble-lined room filled with steam. At that moment, Meikyuu thought to himself that while the building looked stunning from the outside, the interior exceeded all his expectations. He also recalled with nostalgia that lately, in exile, all he had done was wash himself with warm water. And now, in this magnificent bathhouse, he felt a true renewal of both body and soul. The protagonist remembered the advice that one should first wash thoroughly and only then get into the hot bath. Following these simple recommendations, he felt incredibly pleasant, relaxing sensations when he finally immersed himself in the hot tub. The protagonist reflected that in this place, one could truly forget about everything in the world and simply enjoy the moment. Moreover, it seemed to him that keeping track of time in such a peaceful place was a pointless and unnecessary endeavor. Besides, the young man had no doubt that his girlfriend was also having a good time in the women's section. Suddenly, his secluded peace was interrupted by a man in animal form. It was a majestic lion-headed beast man. He politely, with a growl in his voice, asked if he could sit next to him. Somewhat taken aback by such an unexpected neighbor, the young man apologized for his sharp reaction. He admitted, somewhat embarrassed, that this was the first time he'd seen a lion-headed beast man up close. His companion then good-naturedly explained that members of their species rarely settled in cities. However, he said he was a pleasant exception. Laughing, the beast man explained that when he first tried out the local bathhouses, he liked them so much that he couldn't bring himself to leave. At that time, his companions had simply shrugged and walked away, but he decided to stay and settle in this city for good. The protagonist asked with genuine surprise, "Did you really stay in the city just because you wanted to take a bath?" After answering in the affirmative, the Beastman also explained that this wonderful city had delicious food, interesting dungeons, and kind people. Smiling, he felt it was important to note that, in his opinion, earning money to eat one's fill and enjoy bathing was considered the true joy of life. Stunned by such a simple yet wise philosophy, the protagonist said with warmth in his voice that after hearing those words, he himself wanted to settle down in this hospitable city. Realizing that the young man had only recently arrived, the Beastman nodded sympathetically. He noted that in this city, one is free to choose one's own destiny. Smiling, he emphasized that the young man would definitely like it here. He just needed to take a closer look. He fully agreed with the opinion of his new, wise acquaintance. The protagonist tilted his head back once more and savored the time spent in the hot bathhouse. After the bath, the Beastman promised to show him what a good way to spend time looked like after the water treatments. Then he handed him a bottle of milky ale and admitted that this refreshing drink had an incredible, creamy taste. After taking a few cautious sips, the protagonist remarked with delight that it was very tasty and unusual. He also noted that the drink's light fizz pleasantly tickled his throat, and with every sip, it seemed to spread through every cell of his parched body. Smiling at this new sensation, Meikyuu confessed to his friend that he couldn't believe this was even legal and available to ordinary adventurers. At that moment, he reflected on the fact that he was now experiencing a taste that had been inaccessible to him when he was an aristocrat bound by rules. Moreover, the protagonist realized that, upon becoming an adventurer, he had thought only of gloomy dungeons and dangers. But to his own surprise, he meets many kind people and sees many new, amazing things he had never even dreamed of. Meikyuu turned to the Beastman, telling him that he would now look forward to new encounters in this city. He also planned to stop by the bathhouse every day to drink that delicious, milky beverage. Smiling, the protagonist thanked the lion-headed man for introducing him to something so wonderful and simple. Smiling back, the Beastman explained that he was very pleased that his new friend had enjoyed himself and appreciated his advice. The very next day, Deep within the dungeon, the elf squinted and warned that it was too early to attack. The enemy was still too far away. However, the very next moment, she sharply ordered an attack on the monster that had drawn near. Remaining composed and focused, the protagonist, sensing the rhythm of the battle, dealt devastating damage to the monster. Noticing this, Gracie proudly remarked that her friend had held his own well this time and acted with a cool head. After thanking her, the protagonist honestly admitted that he felt much calmer and more confident than before. The girl then explained that this was most likely due to the euphoria he had experienced after his first victory. Responding to his follow-up question, she explained that subtle changes occur in the body after a victory in the dungeon. Furthermore, she noted that the effect varies constantly for each person and is strictly individual. She noted approvingly that her friend had become much calmer and more balanced. However, this was largely the result of his own inner work on himself. Gracie then added that her friend could be proud of himself for such progress. He thanked his friend for her support. The protagonist admitted that he's able to cope with all the difficulties largely thanks to her constant guidance and lessons. Moreover, he noted that at first, he was truly very afraid to fight and even just to hold a weapon in his hands. Meikyuu realized that he wasn't alone now. His devoted friend Gracie was right by his side. He also never would have imagined that fighting side by side with someone, sharing the danger, could be so enjoyable and fulfilling. He realized that a part of his soul was relishing this battle, and he felt genuine joy at becoming stronger and gaining invaluable experience. Smiling, the protagonist told his girlfriend that he was certain he could become a strong and reliable adventurer whom she could count on in any battle. Smiling back, Gracie said with warmth in her voice that this sounded very encouraging and pleasant. She told him he needed to keep up that spirit so that everything would work out for him. Moreover, adopting a more businesslike tone, she added that it was time for them to continue on their way. After a while, carefully examining the walls, Meikyuu discovered a secret, barely noticeable side passage. The friends exchanged glances, decided to take a chance, and found themselves on the 4th floor of the dungeon. Looking around, the girl noted with a note of alarm in her voice that this passage wasn't on any of the maps she'd seen. She also turned to her friend, saying that the best course of action now would be to turn back immediately before they strayed too far. However, at that very moment, the adventurers saw an old, dusty treasure chest standing in the center of the hall. They exchanged glances, their hearts skipping a beat. Gracie asked hesitantly if her friend would open this suspicious chest. He replied in the affirmative, feeling a rush of excitement. The protagonist, without a moment's hesitation, lifted the lid. Inside, on a velvet cushion, they discovered an old, worn book with a leather binding. However, after taking a closer look, Gracie reverently announced that it wasn't just a book, but a genuine relic. She went on to explain that relics are valuable items left behind in labyrinths by ancient adventurers, which possess magical powers. The protagonist also learned that relics come in a wide variety, ranging from armor to what, at first glance, appear to be ordinary tableware. It turned out that, due to their rarity and value, these items are highly prized among the nobility. There are even entire groups of collectors who hunt for them. Swords are the most famous of these relics, but it is said that there are many other types that harbor unknown powers. At that moment, the elf, eyeing the book warily, surmised that it most likely belonged to some old, powerful adventurer. She also thought it important to note that the book looked valuable. But while she could roughly estimate the value of swords and armor at a glance, books were a different matter. Their true value could only be determined after reading them. Gracie asked skeptically whether there was anyone foolish enough to take this relic for themselves without hesitation, unaware of its nature. The protagonist didn't quite understand why his friend was saying this with such skepticism. Then the girl, lowering her voice to a whisper, explained that the book gave off an ominous and dark aura from a mile away. Moreover, she noted with alarm that there was a high probability that this was not just a relic, but a genuine cursed object. If you touch it carelessly and fall under the curse, there won't be a single mage in the world today capable of dealing with it and lifting the curse. They say that in ancient times, there were many powerful mages, and such objects may harbor magic about which absolutely nothing is known in their time. Turning to the young man, the elf explained grimly that if he were cursed, he could easily turn into some kind of terrifying monster, losing himself forever. Terrified by such prospects, the protagonist said to his girlfriend, his voice trembling, that she could have warned him a little earlier, before he opened the chest. After discussing it, the young people decided not to take the suspicious relic with them. They left it exactly where it had been, carefully closing the chest. This decision seemed to both of them to be extremely wise and prudent. As he looked at the closed chest one last time, Meikyuu realized with new clarity that the labyrinth was full of unknown and dangerous objects. And there was always some hidden threat lurking nearby, waiting around every corner. However, at that very tense moment, the young people clearly heard someone's desperate cry for help. The unknown voice, breaking with panic, begged them to come to him as quickly as possible and help him, or he would die. Suddenly, a stranger wearing a skull-like mask appeared from around the corner. As he approached, the protagonist heard that heart-wrenching cry for help once again. Stunned by the surprise, the protagonist couldn't understand how a real skeleton could speak and ask him for help, since this defied all laws of nature. However, at that very moment, the young people, glancing back at the commotion, discovered with alarm that enraged goblins armed with clubs were rushing toward them from all sides. Without wasting a second, the elf, acting like an experienced commander, ordered her friend to cover the stranger while she fired aim shots. Instantly assessing the dangerous situation, Meikyuu shouted loudly, drawing the goblin's attention to himself. He began to maneuver skillfully, acting as a decoy to draw them away from the defenseless skeleton. While the young man fought desperately with his sword, fending off the advancing enemies, his friend used her accurate bow. She took aim with a cool head and fired arrow after arrow, striking the goblins one by one. When the last goblin was defeated and the battlefield fell silent, the skeleton, who had been standing motionless to the side the whole time, said with obvious relief in his voice that he couldn't believe everything had been resolved so quickly and smoothly. And yet, approaching the stranger and putting away her bow, Gracie asked with sincere concern if he was all right, expressing her deepest gratitude. The skeleton admitted sheepishly that he didn't know what he could offer in return for saving his priceless life. Smiling, the girl waved her hand generously and said they didn't need anything, since they were fellow adventurers, and helping one another was their duty. At that moment, the protagonist, feeling awkward, reminded her that all adventurers should help one another when something unexpected happens. And yet, being honest, he admitted that earlier he hadn't quite understood whether he should help a creature that looked very much like a walking skeleton, and that had frightened him. Smiling at his sincerity, the stranger noted with understanding that Meikyuu was quite honest and straightforward, and that this was commendable. He added that this was a perfectly natural reaction, since almost everyone he encountered either ran away in panic or screamed loudly, mistaking him for a monster. Hearing this, Gracie said sympathetically that, by all accounts, her companion must have had a very difficult time in this cruel world. Still, in an effort to lighten the mood, the young people introduced themselves and politely asked for their new friend's name. Removing the hood that concealed his skull, the skeleton introduced himself with dignity as Kizoku. He also remarked with a touch of self-deprecating humor that, as the young people could see, he was a skeleton, and that was his current reality. Meikyuu, scrutinizing his companion closely, suggested skeptically that he wasn't exactly a skeleton, since he could speak, think, and move freely like a human. Then Gracie, who knew a little more about unusual phenomena, explained that the stranger standing before them was a stigma child. Noticing her friend's confusion, she explained that stigma children are those unfortunate souls who were cursed as a result of using some powerful artifact imbued with ancient magic, or those who have borne this curse since birth. The girl also added that this phenomenon is extremely rare. For this reason, it was no surprise that Meikyuu had never heard of it before. Still, driven by curiosity, the protagonist asked Kizoku directly whether she really looked that way because of a cursed artifact. Answering in the affirmative, with sadness in her voice, the skeleton girl explained that she had tried many times to regain her former human form, but all her attempts had proved futile and fruitless. That is precisely why she continues to wander through the very same labyrinth where it all happened, hoping to find at least some clue or solution. Upon hearing this story, the protagonist realized with newfound understanding that it would be extremely difficult for her in this mysterious place. After all, this place is not only home to vicious monsters, but also harbors unsolved mysteries and powerful artifacts capable of both cursing and healing. At that very moment, Kizoku, gathering her courage, asked them to listen carefully. She told them she had one important request for the young people, on which her future fate depended. Folding her hands in a pleading gesture, Kizoku timidly asked for permission to join their small party as a simple porter. Stunned by such an unexpected request, the protagonist asked with genuine surprise if the girl truly wished to join them. Bowing her head, the new acquaintance explained with a touch of shyness that asking for more after being saved would be the height of audacity. However, with her terrifying appearance, she couldn't obtain an official adventurer's license from a guild, and on solo expeditions, she had far fewer opportunities to safely search for answers. The protagonist pondered this proposal. He understood that a person didn't actually need a guild permit to work as a porter. Such a person was very useful on a team, as it made it possible to carry more trophies and supplies, which significantly eased the burden of long expeditions. And yet, After weighing all the risks, he honestly told her that he wasn't ready to accept the offer right away. However, upon hearing his response, Gracie called out to her friend in surprise. She wanted to know the reasons for his refusal, since the girl clearly needed help. With a heavy sigh, Keneal pulled his deep hood back over his head, hiding his skull. She bitterly admitted that, indeed, if she were to stay with the young people, she would most likely be nothing more than a burden and a hindrance in battle. Still, Meikyuu, not wanting to hurt her feelings, hastened to explain that it wasn't a matter of unwillingness, but of safety. He needed a little time to figure out how to ensure her protection. At that moment, turning to his friend, he remarked that hiring a porter was not the same as hiring a servant. In his opinion, he and the elf needed to be absolutely certain that they could ensure Keneal's safety during any dangerous crossings. Folding her arms across her chest, Keneal, touched by his concern, announced with dignity that she would wait for her friends tomorrow at this very same spot at this very same time. Moreover, with hope in her voice, she added that she very much hoped to hear good news from them. That same evening, left alone, the protagonist reflected on how his new acquaintance, too, was completely alone, just as he had been when he first arrived in this unfamiliar city. It turned out that during those gloomy days, he had often cried out of anxiety and a sense of utter helplessness. However, the young man fondly recalled that everything had changed for the better when he met his brave Gracie. Thanks to her, he was able to visit new places and meet interesting people. He felt so happy and at ease that he didn't even notice how he had completely stopped worrying about the past. At that moment, he made a firm decision. He wanted to become just as reliable as support for the skeleton girl. He wanted to show her that she shouldn't be afraid to move forward. At the same time, he was well aware that they had absolutely no idea what this mysterious girl was capable of in battle. Furthermore, the protagonist wasn't sure they'd be able to keep her completely safe deep within the deadly labyrinth. The next day, after descending into the dungeon, Gracie, noticing her friend's pensive mood, asked if something had happened. Or perhaps he hadn't slept because he was worried. Scratching the back of his head, the main character honestly admitted that he'd been thinking about Keneal all night. He then asked what his friend thought about it. Gracie, adjusting her outfit, admitted with a warm smile that she completely trusted her friend's choice. In this delicate situation, she prefers to simply rely on his intuition and decision. However, the young man wasn't entirely satisfied with this answer, even though he was pleased to hear such words of support. At that moment, Gracie, sensing his thoughts, gave him a sly look and said that, by the looks of it, her friend had already made some important decision in his head. Tilting her head to one side, Gracie gently reminded him that it was already time to meet Keneal and they shouldn't be late. At that very moment, a deafening explosion and the sound of falling rocks rang out from somewhere deep within the labyrinth. The young people exchanged anxious glances, looking at each other in confusion. A huge monster, its eyes burning with rage, charged straight toward the young people. It kept hurling large, sharp rocks at them, trying to pin them against the wall. Noticing her friend's frightened reaction, Gracie, trying to stay calm, pointed out that right in front of them was an extremely dangerous troll that was no joke. She called out to Meikyuu just as he was dodging another rock. She stared at the monster in confusion, wondering why such a powerful troll was on the 4th floor of the dungeon, which was considered relatively safe. Then she realized that the creature before them was a kobold eater, the very kobolds the monster was holding in its hand. Having entered into an unequal battle with the troll, the protagonist sought to end the fight as quickly as possible. He anxiously remembered that he needed to meet Keneal as soon as possible, and he couldn't be late. During a swift attack, eager to deal as much damage as possible, the young man misjudged his own strength and, as a result, lost his balance and fell to the ground. Gracie, noticing his fall, looked anxiously at her friend, trying to make sure he was all right. At that very moment, the boy, lying on his back, realized with horror that the enemy before him possessed far greater strength and mass than he could have imagined. However, at that critical moment, summoning all his willpower, he quickly got to his feet and severed the creature's arm. He was surprised to realize that, despite being overweight, he was still quite fast and agile. The monster screamed in pain. In the next second, Gracie, wasting no time, fired her precise arrow straight into the monster's unprotected eye. Stunned by this barrage of attacks, the monster roared in pain, suddenly turned around, and, stomping heavily, headed in the opposite direction, disappearing into the darkness. Stunned by this turn of events, the protagonist asked in bewilderment, could the troll have simply run off on its own, unwilling to continue the fight? At that very moment, exhausted after the grueling battle, the young people, feeling their legs give way, collapsed to the ground. They were breathing heavily, telling each other that the battle had drained every last ounce of their strength. However, a few minutes later, once their breathing had recovered somewhat, they unexpectedly began to laugh. They noted that as soon as they calmed down, a deep, pleasant exhaustion washed over them. At that very moment, the protagonist turned his head and sincerely thanked his girlfriend. He noted that without her by his side, he would most likely have perished long ago in that battle. Noting that the feeling was mutual, the girl also warmly expressed her gratitude to her friend for his bravery. Then, getting to his feet and brushing himself off, the young man asked with a note of anxiety in his voice whether they would be able to make it to Keneal this time. Smiling at his concern, the girl cheerfully explained that they couldn't keep their new friend waiting any longer and that they needed to run. Fully agreeing, the protagonist said with feeling that everything had finally become clear to him, and he had made his decision. Then he thought about how he still wasn't sure if he could protect her in any situation. But spending time with friends who believe in you is really great. And now that he'd finally realized this, all he had to do for her was welcome her onto the team without fear, standing in the very same spot where they'd agreed to meet. Keneal had been waiting for the young people for quite a while, feeling anxious. She had already started to think that nothing had worked out and that they'd changed their minds. However, at that very moment, the breathless but beaming protagonist finally ran up to his friend. Breathing heavily, he asked with a smile if she'd like to join their team right now. Looking Keneal straight in the eyes, the protagonist stated with firm conviction that he needed her strength and help. Taken aback by such candor, the woman asked doubtfully whether the young man was really sure of what he was saying and whether he regretted his decision. She explained nervously that she had been the one to ask for the favor in the first place. But now she was afraid that her presence on the team wouldn't be much help and that she wouldn't be able to live up to their expectations. On top of that, she feared that adventurers might attack them, mistaking her for a hostile monster, which would create additional problems. Then the young man, trying to calm her down, explained that the reason was that they had just finished a grueling battle with a huge troll, and it had taken them a long time. Keneal, genuinely astonished, couldn't believe that such strong and dangerous monsters roamed this floor. Laughing, Meikyuu explained with relief that, in the end, the troll had managed to escape after all. He also honestly admitted that the monster was incredibly strong, and if he'd been alone, he probably wouldn't have even dared to challenge it. However, he felt it was important to note that his loyal companion, Gracie, was by his side at that moment. Thanks to her support, he found the courage to engage in battle, firmly convinced that they would surely emerge victorious. Extending his hand forward in a conciliatory gesture, Meikyuu felt it was important to point out that, up until that moment, his companion had also been completely alone in this world. Perhaps she had felt anxious or afraid, but now they would always be together, shoulder to shoulder. Smiling, Gracie added that in such alliances, appearance didn't matter at all, and together, they would become her strength and support. Folding her hands together in a gesture of gratitude, Keneal wished to express her sincere, deep gratitude for this trust. However, the protagonist, wanting to lighten the mood a bit, remarked with a sly smile that they, too, stood to gain from this alliance. If they managed to defeat that very troll, they're sure to collect a heap of valuable loot. And at that very moment, they'll really need a reliable and strong porter. Smiling at such practicality, Keneal finally relaxed. She shook the young man's hand. She asked for permission to accompany them on their dangerous expeditions. Agreeing to this, the protagonist solemnly noted that they were counting on her greatly. Then, glancing back, he announced that the hunt was over for the day and turned to his friend, asking if she planned to go with him to town. To his surprise, Keneal shook her head. She thanked him for his concern, but politely declined. She noted that she still had some urgent business to attend to, and that they would have to go their separate ways today. She also assured him that she would be happy to continue their fruitful collaboration tomorrow morning. As she said goodbye, the skeleton girl, having already taken a few steps away, called out to the young man, and she promised that she would do her very best and wouldn't let them down. At that moment, Meikyuu, moved by her determination, smiled and replied loudly that they would do their best together. When the girl disappeared around the corner, the young man remarked with a slight smile that it looked like they had some rather busy and eventful days ahead of them. Before leaving the maze, Gracie called out to her friend. With a mysterious look, she asked if he was free that evening. She also explained that she wanted him to keep her company. That same evening, Gracie stood on the balcony, admiring the sunset. With a warm smile, she noticed that Meikyuu had come after all, just as she'd asked. The young man wondered what exactly the girl had meant by keeping her company. Then Gracie, smoothing her hair, admitted that she just wanted to chat with him a little, just the two of them. After all, they would soon have a new companion, and their team would grow. That was exactly why she thought she should first and foremost tell him all about herself properly, so he'd know who he was dealing with. Surprised, the protagonist thought with a touch of embarrassment that, indeed, he and his friend had only ever talked about business, the labyrinth, and monsters. He had never asked her about herself. Then the girl, gazing at the stars, explained that her people, the elves, were the tribe that reads the stars. She explained that the stars guide them in both the right way of life and their own destiny. Pointing to the night sky, studded with stars, she pointed to one of them and explained that if one could figure out when, in what position, and in what color it shines, one could see the path one was destined to follow. At that moment, she noted with a touch of sadness that they, the elven people, had lived this way for millennia, and that this was their way of life. Smiling, she looked at her friend and asked if he considered all of this a silly relic of the past. Gracie went on to say that people believe there is an order to everything, and that all existence is merely a combination of movements. They claim that even the movement of the stars is predetermined, and there is a logic to it. Then the protagonist, who loved to read, remarked that it reminded him of astronomy. He thought he'd read about it in books. At that moment, he turned to his friend and asked her who she thought was really right about all this. Gazing at the night sky, the elf honestly admitted that it was hard for her to judge, not having been on both sides of the issue. However, having been born an elf and living as befits her people, she and her kin had no choice but to follow the fate predestined by the stars. At that moment, Meikyuu, showing his perceptiveness, asked if his friend had really decided to go into the labyrinth precisely because the stars had told her to. And yet, he immediately apologized for his curiosity. He explained that he wasn't good at complex conversations about destiny, but he thought it was a reasonable assumption. Smiling at his insight, Gracie warmly noted that her friend was quite perceptive and observant. And yet she confirmed that when they first met, she had said in advance that she wanted to go down to the 5th underground floor. The protagonist readily confirmed this, saying that he remembered that conversation well. Guided by the stars, Gracie had come to this city in search of rare ingredients for a medicine that was supposed to cure an ailment. Interrupting his friend mid-sentence, the protagonist remarked with sincere concern that if it was so urgent, she should go to the clinic as soon as possible and find the necessary medicine without delay. However, the girl shook her head and gently explained that it wasn't a person who was sick and that this wasn't an ordinary illness. It is a tree disease that affects ancient plants. She told him that in her sacred forest there grows a tree called the sacred tree. It is believed that long ago, a great spirit bestowed its blessing upon it. And at the beginning of each year, its young leaves must be presented as a gift to the royal family as a symbol of peace and prosperity. At that moment, Gracie explained with sadness in her voice that they had always faithfully observed this tradition with the royal family. But the sacred tree had been struck by a disease, and the tips of its leaves had begun to wither and turn black. At that moment, the protagonist, frowning, suggested that perhaps his friend had deliberately chosen this secluded spot on the balcony so that others wouldn't be able to overhear this conversation, which, by all accounts, was extremely important and secret. Then, lowering his voice, he asked, "What exactly will happen if the sacred tree doesn't recover and dies?" Smiling with a hint of sadness in her eyes, Gracie quietly replied that, most likely, she and her family would be banished from the forest, and they would lose their home. It turned out that for the elves, the forest is their home, their blessing, and their best friend. The elves are close to the forest and are able to protect the sacred tree. That is precisely why they were allowed to live in those lands, in their sacred sanctuary. After listening to the whole story, Meikyuu realized with horror that the elves would then lose the right to live in the forest and would simply be driven out of their homeland, just as he himself had once been driven out. And yet, sensing her pain, he sincerely thanked the girl for entrusting him with such an important and deeply held secret. Smiling in response, Gracie warmly reminded him that she had already said she trusted Meikyuu and that he had earned that trust. Furthermore, she admitted that this was the first time she had ever opened up to anyone like this, and so he should cherish the moment. Still, she explained that she was searching for ingredients for a remedy in the labyrinth. She felt she might be a burden to her friend, but she would be grateful for any help or support he could offer. Finishing her candid story, Gracie said with a smile that they'd already been on the balcony too long, and it was time to head back to the inn. Turning around, she saw a young man standing before her, coughing violently and hoarsely, covering his mouth with his hand. Startled, she asked with concern what exactly was wrong with him, and whether this conversation had really been so unpleasant and distressing for him. He shook his head. Meikyuu, wiping away the tears welling up in his eyes, remarked in a breaking voice that he was incredibly happy right now, and that was precisely why he was begging his friend to trust him on this important matter. At that moment, the main character, feeling overwhelmed by his emotions, honestly admitted that he was very happy right then. He understands how important this conversation is to his girlfriend, but right now, he's simply on cloud nine, and he thinks that this might be rude to her. However, he said he wanted to hear her whole story again, properly, so he wouldn't miss a thing. Smiling at his spontaneity, Gracie breathed a sigh of relief and said she agreed and was ready to tell it again if that's what he needed. After listening attentively to her a second time, The protagonist finally calmed down and sincerely assured her that he would be her strength and support. He told her she could rely on him even more. Laughing at his seriousness, Gracie affectionately remarked that her friend needed to get a good night's sleep before tomorrow's expedition so he'd be in top shape. The next day, the young people, full of determination, set off for the dungeon together with their new friend, the skeleton Camille. Then the protagonist, noticing a huge, massive shield behind her, asked in surprise where the girl had gotten such serious gear. Camille then proudly admitted that she had spent the previous day preparing that shield. She had purchased it at a reputable armor shop. She also assured him that she would make sure it wouldn't get in the way of carrying things. In response, Gracie said approvingly that she'd heard porters also choose their own personal protective gear, and she thought that was absolutely right and sensible. However, the protagonist, who was concerned about his new friend, wondered if the shield wasn't too heavy for her fragile, skeletal frame. Camille explained with a slight smile that, while it might be a side effect of her new cursed form, she had become much physically stronger than she had been as a human. She assured him that she wouldn't be outmatched in strength even by low-level monsters. Smiling, Meikyuu said with relief that this sounded extremely promising, and that he continued to count on his new friend. Unexpectedly, at that very moment, a huge kobold burst out of the darkness of the labyrinth. Gracie instantly assessed the situation and suggested they split into two groups. The next moment, she had already fired a precise arrow at the creature. To draw its attention, catching up to the monster, which had run off to the side, the young man drew his sword, intent on dealing devastating damage. However, in the next instant, the monster, proving to be stronger, deftly parried the blow, and only his new leather bracers managed to save the young man from suffering a terrible wound. Suddenly, sensing a weaker target, the magical creature spun around sharply, and it headed toward the skeletal girl, who seemed defenseless to it. However, Camille, without losing her composure or showing fear, instantly raised her enormous shield in front of her, taking the blow herself. She noticed the shock and surprise on her friends' faces. Camille proudly noted that, just as she had said, she was every bit as strong as the monsters and capable of standing up for herself. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.